Hey everybody. I've been thinking about the 30s a lot lately. For some reason, that bygone era of massive wealth inequality, social unrest, political upheaval, and environmental catastrophe really strikes a chord with me in 2026. And whenever I think about the era, my thoughts inevitably turn to one of its most bizarre sideshows, Roger Babson. I actually did a video about him a few years ago. It was only 9 minutes long and excluded a bunch of his wildest exploits. He's worth a deeper dive. This guy's story goes places. I've covered objectively weirder guys, but Babson still sticks out as my strangest subject somehow. He was a jack of all trades. Like, Iola, Wisconsin has this sign commemorating their most famous resident, the world's tallest actor, lawyer. He isn't individually the tallest actor or lawyer, but he's the tallest actor, lawyer. Babson is like that. He's the weirdest economist, physicist. Put another way, his weirdness was diversified in a way that's rare outside of creative fields. I could do an hour on the antics of guys like P.T. Barnum or Harry Houdini. If I hated myself a little more, I could probably get an hour out of Dave Sim, too. But those guys were performers. They had to do or say crazy stuff to put food on the table. Babson was different. He believed in everything he did and did most of it in his off time with no profit incentive. He was a natural-born weirdo. This weirdo was born naturally in Gloucester, Massachusetts in 1875, and Massachusetts is where he'd spend most of his days. His childhood was mostly uninteresting in the way you'd expect of a middle-class New Englander. The most persistent conflict of his early life, as far as I can tell, is that his dad wanted him to pursue business while he had an interest in engineering. His dad didn't think highly of MIT, believing that engineering and the like would only lead to one-job business, i.e. jobs you do once and get paid for once. What young Roger needed, he insisted, was repeat business. Roger recalls in his autobiography, he suggested merchandising, banking, insurance, and public utility operation, but not public utility construction. He explained to me that the world's greatest invention was 6% compound interest, which goes on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and 52 weeks a year. This conflict between science and business informed much of his schooling and, in turn, much of his adult life. As did his sister's death by drowning and a brush with tuberculosis at 26, both of which I'll come back to later. For now, just keep in mind that basically everything I'm about to tell you can be traced back to one of these three things. Like everyone, he distracted himself from bleak reality with a hobby. Namely, he was obsessed with Isaac Newton. Not to a normal, nerdy academic degree, mind you. No, Babson was weird about Newton. There is an entire section on his Wikipedia page titled Interest in Isaac Newton. When he got filthy rich later in life, he purchased a room from Newton's last home and had it shipped to his house. He did the same thing with a bed from Warwick Castle that Newton may have slept in one time, and also his death mask, previously owned by Thomas Jefferson. Which is a weird thing to buy, of course, but also like a depressing thing for the Newton family to have sold, right? And amazingly, Babson managed to find and marry the only person in history who was more insane than him about Isaac Newton. Grace Babson's collection is considered the best in America. Aside from an impressive collection of books, she transported the parlor of Newton's final home to the third floor of the Babson College Library. From Babson's autobiography again, when the house was torn down for the erection of a large modern building, Mrs. Babson purchased the portion most used by Newton and had it brought to Wellesley. It has been re-erected exactly as occupied by Sir Isaac Newton, with the same walls, doors, and even the identical shutters containing the hole through which he carried on his first experiments in connection with the diffusion of light. She also took a graft from the famous Newton apple tree and used it to plant her own tree on campus. She and Roger are now buried together near what's now an orchard. I'm gonna make fun of this dude a lot, so before the goofing commences, I want to take a moment to appreciate how genuinely beautiful that is. Good for them. Naturally, the Newton obsession made its way into his professional life. He got himself an engineering degree, and in 1904 he founded the Babson Statistical Organization using money he made through investing. In other words, basically through living his own dream and his father's dream simultaneously, which is exemplified in the Statistical Organization, where he applied the third law of thermodynamics to the world of economic forecasting. Which doesn't work. I really understated how ridiculous this was in my first video. The economy doesn't seesaw like physical matter and energy does. It booms and busts based on the availability of and the demand for certain resources and the increasingly complex ways in which those resources are handled. Money is something that exists entirely in our heads, and it's exactly as complex as every other delusion of the human psyche. But if you wanted to pretend the third law was a thing you could apply to the economy, the early 20th century was maybe the best time to do that. Babson's predictions were rocky, yet consistent enough that his company had made him a millionaire by the mid-1910s. People believed in him, and he had better advice than you might expect. His strategy was working, even if he was slowly garnering the ire of his fellow economists. He was bumbling his way into a lot of correct answers using the incorrect formula. One day, that was going to come back to bite some poor investors. That's how the universe works, right? Playing the game the right way is always rewarded. The forces of fate never just give up, shotgun a can of Milwaukee's finest, and laugh as they hand a pot of gold to the least qualified guy they could possibly give it to. Right? On September 5th, 1929, Babson tried to warn everybody that the Roaring Twenties were about to hit their equal and opposite reaction. He said, the stock market will fall by its own weight. Other, more prominent and influential figures disagreed. Everyone's favorite president, Herbert Hoover, rushed to assure America the market was sound. Winston Churchill agreed. Irving Fisher, an economist of unparalleled repute, was quoted in October saying, stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. This sentiment was strong. Through automation and industrialization, infinite growth was finally achievable, and we were all headed to new heights together. Fisher and the newspaper barons were quick to outright mock Babson, highlighting his past errors and questionable methods. And then, 12 days after Irving opened his mouth, fate decided to shove his foot right into his stomach. Suddenly he and Babson's positions were reversed. Fisher was the idiot, and Babson was America's sweetheart. Babson found success throughout the Depression. Hell, he stayed in the public eye well into the 50s, mostly on the back of his economic writing. And keep in mind, he was still relatively young back then. The guy was rich and famous at a young age during one of the country's bleakest decades. Looking at it that way, it's no wonder he got so weird with his money. You're probably picturing some Great Gatsby-type parties, but anyone can do that. I wouldn't be talking about him if he were just some normal rich guy. Babson didn't party at all. He didn't even drink. Not only did he not drink, he ran for president as a prohibitionist in 1940. There's a whole book he wrote about this campaign, which I haven't read. I already read several chapters of his autobiography for this video, and I just don't have the time of day lately. I'll link it in my sources if you're curious, but running as a prohibitionist itself kinda says a million words about the kind of guy he was, right? Do you know how committed to the cause you have to be to advocate prohibitionism less than 10 years after an entire decade of evidence that it doesn't work? Yet, despite that, Babson placed fourth in the 1940 election, trailing the Democrats, Republicans, and Socialists with 0.12% of the vote. That makes him one of the country's final relatively successful prohibitionists, even if he was less popular on the whole than many of his predecessors and some of his successors. His wealth and celebrity brought attention to the party it might not have attained otherwise, though his take on prohibitionism alienated many potential supporters. He was a devout and outspoken Protestant. One article I read stated, he had the uncanny ability to pull a Bible out of nowhere to make an unrelated point. His belief was that forced abstinence was a necessary step toward moral reform in America. So, booze wasn't the central focus of his campaign, which seems to have pushed out more people than it attracted. At the end of the day, though, he was a fringe candidate and a smart enough guy to know he was never going to win. His goal was exclusively getting his word out there, and, well, we're still talking about him in 2026. In a roundabout way, he did what he set out to do, even if I'm dead certain I'm not contributing to the moral salvation of America he envisioned. Also, want to point out that he might have been able to beat the socialists if he'd talked more about the economy. Not only because he was the guy who predicted Black Monday, but listen to this excerpt from his autobiography. I look forward to the time when a man will operate his business in the same spirit in which he holds a public trust or serves as the director of a hospital or library. This changed attitude on the part of employers would unconsciously change the attitude of wage workers also. Today, these workers are not interested in increasing production because they feel that the benefits from such increased production would go only to the employers and stockholders. If, however, they were convinced that the benefit from increased production above a certain point would be divided fairly between the customers, stockholders, and themselves, life would have a different aspect. We must think more of others. That passage is safely in line with a lot of moderate socialists, social democrats, and the like. And don't get me wrong, Babson was no socialist. He was, at best, a conservative capitalist with a couple beliefs you could generously describe as egalitarian. In truth, he distrusted the poor and basically anyone who wasn't a white Protestant. His beliefs on socialism were as follows. Any nation, however, which now attempts to operate under a socialistic system in a competition with nations operating under private control and initiative would be licked to a frazzle. But he could have some crossover appeal. His loathing of debt comes to mind. And even before the Red Scare, a competent socialist candidate was a hard thing to come by. The kind of voter who swings that way is willing to pinch their nose a little, you know? I think Babson could have carved out a little niche among a weird sample platter of underserved voters. I don't know. Wait, no, I figured out how to describe the ideal Babson voter. You remember when Joe Rogan endorsed Bernie? I think Babson could have swung that demographic. I feel obligated to say for my friend Jason's sake that this is all following Babson family friend William Gibbs McAdoo's failed presidential run. McAdoo is like Jason's personal Roman Empire and a guy I might want to come back to. And in fact, Babson is a minor player in plenty of politicians' lives, up to and including a bunch of presidents. For example, he worked at the Department of Labor while Hoover was the Secretary of Commerce. Hoover wanted rid of the entire department while Babson fought tooth and nail for its continued existence, which drove a wrench between them. Babson retained a genuine respect for Hoover as a politician, but also cites this incident as the reason he, quote, was never one of his confidants after he became president. The entire acquaintance with presidents chapter of his autobiography is maybe the most immediately captivating in the entire book. I wish I had time to include more of it here. He advised a handful of presidents through the early 20th century, which has me second-guessing his goofy economic stances because, that's when the economy was good, wasn't it? I'm going to end the political talk here for now, though, because I have a million other stories to tell about this guy. Before moving on, though, I need to include this one anecdote from the end of the chapter in which Roger explains how his on-and-off presence in the White House turned permanently off. It's more than likely the longest uninterrupted quote I'll include here because there is literally no way for me to make this story funnier. Here we go. Having known Franklin Roosevelt well during World War I was free to consult him from 1933 to 1945. Once during World War II, he sent for me and offered me a very attractive position. I told him he should give the opportunity to a younger man, especially as I then owed to my clients all my time and energy. Babson's reports were performing most important war work, while the Babson Institute was training 2,000 naval officers in accounting and purchasing. President Roosevelt then said to me, "But Roger, is there any job which would interest you?" I thought for a moment and then replied, "Yes, I would accept the position of being advisor to the world's boss." To this the president replied, "But Roger, I have too many advisors now." To this I answered, "I do not mean you, but rather Mr. Stalin." That was in 1943. He abruptly changed the subject and never sent for me again. Neither has any president since. Babson also had some fun in the art world, and as one might expect, he didn't go for the usual paintings or statue of himself. Instead, during the Great Depression, he hired down-on-their-luck stonecutters to carve inspiring messages into boulders around Dogtown, Massachusetts. His idea was to provide the people of the era with hope and solid advice. Some of them are too generic to really mean much, others contain pull-yourself-up-by-the-bootstraps tier advice that might have been more helpful prior to an unprecedented recession. In his autobiography, he claims he cured his tuberculosis through sheer willpower and working hard to cure himself, which dovetails into a lecture about the virtue of hard work. A lot of these boulders reflect that mentality. You can beat the Great Depression by simply working real hard at a time when nobody is hiring. His well-founded obsession with staying out of debt, which I haven't really mentioned here, but yeah, the dude hated debt after a couple of run-ins with the banks, is represented as well. Some other boulders are without category. Help Mother. These are all currently gathered on the same hiking trail, and I can't imagine how bizarre it would be to stumble into this without context. Any other eccentric rich dude, the boulders would be his whole legacy. Just a guy with money who gave some unemployed stonecutters a weird paying gig during tough times. Not Babson. Like I said, he did all the weird rich guy stuff. In 1919, he founded Babson College, a Massachusetts business school which is still active today, and Weber College, a school for women that isn't. Babson College has produced a number of notable alumni, including the aforementioned McAdoo and also the co-founder of Home Depot. It makes a weird kind of sense that Home Depot is connected to Roger Babson in some capacity, right? He also filed a patent for a parking meter that powered itself using your car battery. You had to hook it up yourself. Which sounds like an invention from that one Jackbox game. Why does this have its own section on his Wikipedia page? Tragically, even decades of success in various fields isn't sufficient to stave off cruel reality. Babson's grandson drowned in 1947, rekindling decades-old trauma and changing the trajectory of his life forever. In 1948, he wrote the essay Gravity, Our Enemy Number One. Despite the X-1 title, this is a completely sincere piece of writing in which he recounts the deaths of his sister and grandson. And a lot of different things, actually. This is a remarkably unfocused 4 pages, and honestly, it's way different than I expected from how it's described in most of the pop history articles about this guy. Those articles tend to focus in on the couple of lines that are explicitly about gravity, which I think are all I read the last time I did a video about this guy. What surprised me is those lines are kinda all he wrote about gravity. Most of the essay is spent recounting a bunch of conversations he's had about air quality. This is gonna take a bit. When he was 26, he had tuberculosis. Doctors took him to the mountains out west to get him to a higher altitude because the air was purer up there. There's more oxygen, relatively speaking, due to the low moisture. And, the doctor went on, there's low moisture because water is heavier than oxygen, so gravity draws it lower. So began his obsession with gravity. Later in life, he got to know the owner of the Sturtevant Blower Company, an enthusiast on fresh air named Eugene Foss, who also used to be the governor of Massachusetts. He served 3 terms, his anti-labor policies were unpopular, and he declined an opportunity to run under the banner of the Bull Moose Party. Kind of an archetypal early 20th century scumbag, and the exact kind of guy whose policies led to the Great Depression, which makes him a funny guy for Babson to be palling around with. To be fair, he sounds like an interesting conversationalist. Babson quotes him as having said, "One of the greatest causes of illness is bad air, in which people are being drowned as if they were thrown into the ocean. Old man gravity is responsible." This reminded Roger of his battle with tuberculosis. It influenced where he lived. He moved out west and then to a hilly part of New England as to avoid dangerous, heavier-than-oxygen molecules like water. He also began to research other deaths and injuries inflicted by old man gravity and came away shocked that so many people broke their bones or died when they fell, for some reason. Why was he surprised by that? This dude is so weird, man. I love him. And then after that, he describes his grandson's death at length. It's most of a whole page. In short, a woman fell off a boat. His grandson Michael leapt in to save her. Quote, "He succeeded in getting the woman back into the boat. She is healthy and happy today, but that dragon gravity came up and snatched Michael. He was so exhausted he couldn't fight this force which pulled him to the bottom. In fact, it was 5 days before his body was found." There are thousands of such accidents every summer, notwithstanding the fact that most boats carry life preservers which are practical anti-gravity aids. If these would be more freely used, deaths from drowning would be greatly reduced. But most people, especially good swimmers, think it is a sign of weakness, or is sissified to use these aids for fighting gravity. This is a great mistake and should be corrected by all swimming teachers. Since Michael's death, I have become more and more interested in the subject of gravity. It seems as if there must be discovered some partial insulator of gravity which could be used to save millions of lives and prevent accidents. In addition, it is my belief that someday gravity will be harnessed to provide a free source of power. For these and other reasons, I am greatly interested in the Gravity Research Foundation. And then he just goes back to talking about air quality. Look, we all grieve in different ways. My own essay about my grandfather's passing is unfocused at best. But at least I didn't end it with a call to action about improving air quality by inventing anti-gravity. His grandson's death had to be included in the essay. It's the spark that reignited his interest in this field. There's a time and a place, man. You don't just wedge it in between 2 passages about air quality and how your make-believe technology would improve it. I'm being unfair, of course. The make-believe technology would have saved Michael's life, too. It would have done everything. I just quoted him saying he thinks it'll be used to provide free power, but see also, broken hips and other broken bones, as well as numerous circulatory, intestinal, and other internal troubles, are directly due to the people's inability to counteract gravity at a critical moment. Or, when a fire gets underway, superheated combustion gases ranging from 800 to 2,000 degrees in temperature defy gravity and quickly flood the upper halls of a house, hotel, or office building. These lethal gases enter bed and other upper rooms through open doors and transoms and asphyxiate the occupants. This means that gravity can work against us in 2 opposite ways, which he doesn't really offer a solution for, unfortunately. I'd love to know if he had a plan to deal with the many downsides of using anti-gravity to send all the bad air molecules upwards. As far as I can tell, he just mentions that it's an issue and moves on. And before we move on, I have to mention this mystifying footnote. It's my favorite part of the essay. Quote, "Not only is the rural air purer, But if you are so located that it blows through a pine forest before you breathe it in, you are very fortunate. The air of the woods is not only pure, but medicated. It possesses chemical and/or electrical qualities which are of great value. The ideal sanitarium would be so constructed that the patients would sleep in the forest, but be wheeled out into the sunshine during the day. Piney woods air, shaded sunlight, and sparkling spring water with proper food and rest should cure almost anyone. He just offhandedly remarks in a footnote that he thinks you can cure tuberculosis by going camping. I completely skipped over that the first time I talked about this dude. Can you see why I wanted to give him another go? Every time I think he can't get any weirder, he gets weirder. Speaking of weird, the actual properties of the made-up anti-gravity tech are kept vague in the essay. He uses the term partial insulator a lot without ever providing a great explanation, though admittedly it's a pretty obvious term. But even if it's obvious, I personally think that if you make up a term, you should probably define it. So, in short, a partial insulator is a theoretical material which Babson envisioned as an alloy that would have partially insulated you from the effects of gravity. A few posited uses include airplanes and shoes. Not long after writing this essay, he formed the Gravity Research Institute in order to begin research into such a material. Kinda. Being phenomenally wealthy and pretty old by now, our boy didn't feel like doing the grunt work by himself. Instead, he got into the habit of paying other people to research anti-gravity for him. He bought out the DC-based Invention Incorporated, so he constantly had a team poring over newly filed patents for anything gravity-related, including gravity-related power generation, which he discusses in his autobiography through a rant about perpetual motion machines. He didn't buy into any of the current perpetual motion machines, but believed perpetual motion was feasible and wanted to be around when it was accomplished. Owing to a conversation with Thomas Edison, because of course he knew Thomas Edison, Babson was also interested in birds. He said, "It is very possible that a wing will someday be constructed of some partial anti-gravity alloy, which will enable lightweight, muscular persons to fly under their own power. Animals such as flying squirrels are an illustration of what may be accomplished along these lines." I think it's interesting how well this is aged compared to a lot of Babson's beliefs. Anti-gravity guys still love birds and bees, and these days we have wingsuits designed after flying squirrel flaps. He was actually onto something for once. Also, the conversation with Edison inspired Babson to start collecting birds. By the time he founded the Gravity Research Institute, he had over 5,000 dead birds to his name and planned to will them to the institute. I can't find any reliable information on what happened to them. There may have been a Thomas Edison bird museum at some point. It's mostly interesting as a bit of characterization to me. He never seriously studied birds. It seemed more like another obsession he used to remember a dead person he respected. And also, Edison brought birds up because of Babson's gravity fixation, which means that was a known quantity prior to Edison's death in 1931. In 1949, George Rideout, the president of Babson Reports, suggested that Babson fuel gravity research by offering cash prizes to promising essays in the field. The goal being to amass a library of information on gravity, hoping we could fill in the blanks by collecting everything that surrounded them. To start, the first prize was $1,000, which ain't a bad chunk of change for one essay. A lot of people were interested. The Institute also printed some material of its own. Titles include Gravity and Psychology by Raymond Wheeler, Is Free Power Possible by George Rideout, who I guess was a gravity guy too. I kinda assumed he was just an economy guy. Gravity and Posture by Mary E. Moore. Gravity and Ventilation by Roger Babson, because apparently he hadn't spent enough time talking about how anti-gravity would improve air quality. Gravity and Sitting by Roger Babson. And Gravity in Your Feet by William Drake. Everything was going smoothly for the fledgling Gravity Research Institute. Except one thing. It was 1949. 4 years ago, physics had been completely reshaped in a forge that burned as bright as 1,000 suns. America had just dropped the Rapture's closest living relative on Japan. Twice. Armageddon was a weapon mortal man could mass produce. He needed to ensure that the Foundation and its library would survive if the worst came to pass. So Babson was moving again, and for once in his life it wasn't about air quality. Experts at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, he said, advised a location which would be relatively free from damage should a bomb be dropped on Boston. Which sounds pretty official when he says it, though in practice what it entails is he drew a circle 60 miles wide around Boston and chose New Boston basically at random. At least that's what a lot of articles I read online said, but this time around I actually read his autobiography in which he adds that he also took into account how self-sufficient the town could be in the case it was cut off from Boston. It had to be as independently sustainable as possible. That meant he was looking for a place with clean water, no polluting industrial plants, local agriculture, the whole shebang. In spite of what I said in my first video and what a lot of people online have said, he put some work into this. I think maybe it got conflated with the magic circle, which was more arbitrary. In short, around the same time Babson was fighting gravity, he was also issuing grave warnings to the industrial leaders of America. So much of our industry was on the coast, right down the sights of Soviet missiles. He drew a circle in the heartline and proselytized at length about its importance to the industrial future of America. As in, we wouldn't have an industrial future if we didn't move all the factories to Kansas and a vaguely defined area around Kansas. The magic circle changed size on a whim, only the center was ever nailed down. Eureka, Kansas, a town of 4,000 people. He initially wanted to set the heart of the circle in Utopia, Kansas, on the basis that he was a big fan of Thomas More's 1516 book Utopia. Unfortunately, it was too rural and not quite close enough to the country's geographical center, so he went with Eureka instead, although the true geographical center of America is actually Lebanon. He came off pretty damn enthused about his hyper-arbitrary second choice regardless, calling it the Stalingrad of America. He went on, Boston and New York will be wiped out, no question about it. They're probably not much good anyway, they're not producing anything. He built Utopia College in the town and invited its entire population to his first lecture at the school. After that, he handed the reins over to the faculty, who did their best. The school, as far as I can tell, topped out under 50 students and lost money annually until it shut its doors in 1970. Its goal, in theory, was educating the people of the Magic Circle on how to best go about establishing their position as the post-apocalyptic industrial capital of the world. In practice, the concept of the Magic Circle was something too vague to be taught. Babson and the gang never did much to establish what exactly their vision was beyond moving the factories to the heartland. Students were left with courses teaching the kind of junk you could get from any one of Babson's bajillion books. Vagaries about keeping your family safe in the end times, a lot of talk about hard work, and, of course, Bible studies. Because a mass conversion to Protestantism was essential to surviving the apocalypse, obviously. There was also some stuff about social Darwinism in there. Part of Babson's interest in the apocalypse came from a belief in survival of the fittest. Which is funny from a guy whose idea of a hard day's work appears to be inventing a terrible solution to one of society's existential woes and giving up on implementing it the moment he had to put in a modicum of effort. University President Bowers also claimed that once the Protestant utopia had been established, once again with Eureka, Kansas of all places at its center, international baseball teams will span the North Pole overnight to play in the various world capitals. Which I think says it all. They were too busy fantasizing about post-apocalyptic Protestant baseball to fill in the details. Hey, as somebody who used to do sci-fi world building as a hobby, it happens to the best of us. Utopia College was completely unaccredited, ill-defined, and they didn't tell anyone they were doing this until all the pieces were in place. In addition to that, the Magic Circle project was kinda doomed by default, and the federal government opposed any form of decentralization because it was expensive and wouldn't have been great for the big cities most representatives hailed from. Meanwhile, state governments in the heartlands were coordinating actual professional efforts to attract industry and veterans looking for homes. And the feeling among the average American was that decentralization was pointless when, just a couple years into the arms race, one bomb could already render most of the continent uninhabitable. Decentralization fell out of mainstream favor faster than Irving Fisher on Black Monday. A rich goofball's fantasies of doing the same unpopular thing himself as part of a half-baked plan to turn Kansas into a Protestant doomsday cult was never destined for success. The Magic Circle technically endured for about a decade, but it feels like Babson's enthusiasm ran out about 2 years in. Speaking of which, knowing what comes next, this all looks like a dry run for his time in New Boston. He became obsessed with a grand scheme connected to a specific location, went to that location, threw together a half-assed base of operations, tried to convince people the place he settled was uniquely apocalypse-proof, put no work into that place, and then buzzed off when it failed. I'm dead serious he's about to do the exact same thing again. Check out this sign he installed at New Boston city limits. Property here should sell for 3 times its current price. That's an interesting way to put it. Well, here's the thing. Babson bought a lot of real estate in New Boston, as in almost half the town. All ostensibly to support the Gravity Research Foundation, which still barely did anything and had no clear direction. Sometimes it seemed like things were progressing. He bought a water-powered mill to run experiments and a building he was converting into a conference center. There was talk of building a proper full-scale lab, too. But for most of the town, Babson's touch was a death sentence. Former employee Yvonne Gomez describes most of the town's real estate as a whim that never got finished. Many buildings fell into disrepair. You could easily mistake Babson's New Boston for a ghost town. The lab idea fell through because he wanted the foundation to exist as a means of encouraging others to do their own research. In his autobiography, he wrote, "It must avoid such work in order that inventors and others may feel free to send to the foundation their own ideas, knowing that the foundation will not take unfair advantage thereof." Which is, of course, business jargon that means Babson is starting to second-guess his midlife crisis. That's not a particularly charitable reading of Babson's life work, of course, but it's not like he wouldn't have been used to uncharitable sentiment. He was never embraced as a resident of the town, merely an eccentric outsider who lingered at its peripheries. Sometimes a nuisance, occasionally a source of entertainment. Never particularly proactive at anything except making the town worse. There's also the sheer insanity of his beliefs. He was simply too far out for small-town America in the 50s. These days, a lot of his sci-fi ideas are things even kids might know about thanks to the prevalence of mainstream science fiction. Back then, though, his proposals for perpetual motion or gravity-proof shoes felt like nothing more than the fever dreams of an out-of-touch rich man. My favorite anecdote is the one where Babson made guests sit on chairs designed so their heads were positioned lower than their feet. The blood rushed to your head, and Babson claimed it was an example of the kinds of horrible pain gravity could inflict. He demonstrated this chair as a part of the yearly Gravity Research Foundation convention, one of few things that ever threatened to endear him to the population of New Boston. Every August, he allowed anyone to come into his conference hall, basically the only building he actually used, and talk about gravity. There were lectures, Q&As, and practical demonstrations. These events put New Boston on the map. They attracted upwards of 75 guests, most of whom spent money while they were in town. The small businesses that still existed between Babson's legion of ghosts profited from the conferences, which redeemed him in some people's eyes. He'd given the town a place in American history and made a couple people a little money. And who could forget the years of free entertainment? To the people of New Boston, he was an annoying spectacle. To the world of physics, he was the shepherd. The Gravity Research Foundation's conferences and essay contests turned weirdly legit over the years, especially following Babson's death. No longer the front lines in a war against basic physics, the foundation is relocated to Wellesley, and its only function now is the essay contest. The top prize is 4 big ones, and winners include every physicist you've ever heard of, up to and including Epstein Files alumnus Stephen Hawking. This is a big deal. Science that isn't immediately applicable to the military or corporations isn't as prestigious as a lot of people imagine. Getting a decent chunk of change and a little bit of recognition is about all some of these people can ever hope for. A lot of them also tout that these short-form, low-level papers are an opportunity to put their complicated work out there in a smaller, more digestible format. In theory, that's true. In practice, recent winners include the cosmological constant problem in brane worlds and gravitational Lorentz variations, proper time quantization of a thin shell, Lorentzian quintessential inflation, holographic inflation, primordial black holes and early structure formation, and universal acceleration in fuzzy dark matter. To be fair, there are some titles that don't terrify me, like In Search of the Biggest Bang Since the Big Bang, or my personal favorite, It Costs Nothing to Teleport Information into a Black Hole. What could that possibly mean? I like to think Babson would have been satisfied with the modern foundation, even if anti-gravity isn't the explicit focus. After all, knowing our enemy so intimately will surely help us overcome it. Hell, I'm still young. According to my analytics, you're probably young too. We might live to see Babson's partial insulator realized. Until then, remember, therapy is probably a better option than blowing thousands on ill-conceived research on half-baked sci-fi technology. And help Mother.